So today in this video I'll be explaining the full history of the Boston Celtics. So the Boston Celtics are currently located in Boston, Massachusetts, and they compete in the NBA as a member of the Eastern Conference in the Atlantic Division. They currently perform in the TD Garden, which they share with the Boston Bruins. They currently have 17 NBA championships, the most in NBA history. And they've had several MVPs such as Bob Cousy, Bill Russell, Dave Cowens, and Larry Bird. So let's just get started with their full history. The Boston Celtics were formed in 1946 by Boston Garden Arena Corporation President Walter A. Brown as a team in the BAA and became part of the NBA after the absorption of the NBL by the BAA in the fall of 1949. 1950, the Boston Celtics signed Chuck Cooper, becoming the first NBA franchise to draft an African American player. So, for a few years, they struggled under the hiring of coach Red Auerbach. In the franchise's early days, Auerbach had no assistants. He ran all of the practices, did all of the scouting, both of opposing teams and college draft prospects, and scheduled all of the road trips. One of the first great players to become a Celtic was Bob Cousy, which I mentioned earlier as becoming an MVP, which Auerbach eventually refused to draft him because he thought he was too flashy. He eventually became property of the Chicago Stags, but when they went bankrupt, the Celtics got him in the dispersal draft. After the 1955-1956 season, Auerbach made a shocking trade. He sent All-Star Ed McCauley to the St. Louis Hawks along with the draft rights to Cliff Hagan in exchange for the second pick in the 1956 draft. After they negotiated trades with the Rochester Royals, a negotiation that included a promise that the Celtics owner would send the highly sought after ice capades to the Royals if they let Bill Russell slide to the second overall pick, which Auerbach used to pick Bill Russell. He also acquired Rookie of the Year eventually later in 1957, Tom Heinsohn. Russell and Heinsohn worked extraordinarily well with Cousy, and they were the players around whom Auerbach would build a championship Celtics for over a decade. So with Bill Russell leading the team, they advanced to the NBA Finals, and they defeated the Atlanta Hawks, then known as the St. Louis Hawks, in 7 games, giving them their first NBA championship. Russell went on to win 11 NBA championships, making him the most decorated player in NBA history. In 1958, they again advanced to the finals, this time losing the Hawks in 6 games, but after the acquisition of K.C. Jones, they began a dynasty that would last for almost a full decade and even a little more. So in 1959, they won an NBA championship after sweeping the Minneapolis Lakers, the first of their 8 consecutive championships. And during that time, the Celtics met the Lakers in 5 finals, starting a tense and often bitter rivalry that has spanned generations. In 1964, the Celtics became the first NBA team to have an all-African-American starting lineup. In 1964, Willie Knowles replaced an injured Tom Heinsohn, joining Tom Sanders, K.C. Jones, Sam Jones, and Bill Russell in the starting lineup. The Celtics defeated the St. Louis Hawks 97-84, and Boston won its next 11 games with Knowles starting in place of Heinsohn. The Celtics of the late 50s and early 60s are widely considered as one of the most dominant teams of all time. Auerbach retired as coach after the 1965-1966 season, and Bill Russell took over as the player coach, which was Auerbach's ploy to keep Russell interested in staying with the team. So with his appointment, Russell also became the first African-American coach in any pro sport at the time. Auerbach would remain the general manager that he would hold well into the 80s. However, that year the Celtics string of NBA titles was broken as they lost to the Philadelphia 76ers in the Eastern Conference Finals. The team was aging at the time and managed two more championships in 1968 and 1969, defeating the Los Angeles Lakers each time in the finals. Bill Russell retired after the 1969 season, ending a dynasty that garnered 11 NBA championships in 13 seasons, which is 8 consecutive. Currently, is still a record of the longest streak of consecutive championships. In the 1970 season, it was a rebuilding year as the Boston Celtics had their first ever losing record since the 1949-1950 season, almost 20 years. However, with the acquisition of Dave Cowens, Paul Silas, and JoJo White, the Celtics soon became not what they once were, but they were still dominant. After losing the Eastern Conference Finals in 1972, they regrouped and came out determined in 1973 and posted a 68-14 record. But the season was a disappointment, and they were upset in 7 games by the New York Knicks in the conference finals. John Havlicek injured his right shoulder in Game 6 and was forced to play Game 7 shooting left-handed. But the Celtics returned to the playoffs the next year, defeating the Milwaukee Bucks in the NBA Finals in 1974 for their 12th NBA championship. They split the first 4 games, and after the Celtics won Game 5 in Milwaukee, they headed back to Boston, leading 3-2, with a chance to win the NBA championship. But Kareem Abdul-Jabbar nestled a hook shot with 3 seconds left in the game, second overtime, and the series returned to Milwaukee. But Dave Cowens came back, and he scored 28 points as the Celtics won yet another NBA championship. Then a couple years later, in 1976, they won another championship, defeating the young Phoenix Suns in 6 games that featured one of the greatest games in the NBA history. With the series tied at 2 games apiece, the Suns trailed early in the Boston Garden, but came back to force overtime. In double overtime, a Gar-Hurd turnaround jumper at the top of the key sent the game to a third overtime, at which point the Celtics prevailed. Tom Heinsohn coached the team for those 2 NBA championships. After the 1976 championship and them making the playoffs the year after that, they went into another rebuilding phase, which in the 1977 NBA draft, they selected Cedric Maxwell, which he was considered a bust. He did really not contribute much in his rookie season, but he showed a little bit of promise. Auerbach's job became a lot tougher because that year, John Havlicek retired, which was the Celtics' all-time leading scorer. In the 1978 NBA draft, they had 2 of the top 8 picks. Since they had 2 draft choices, Red Auerbach took a risk, and he selected Larry Bird with the 6th pick in the draft, knowing Bird would stay in college for another year. They would retain his rights for 1 year, but that rule was later changed, and Auerbach believed Bird's potential would make it worth the wait. Auerbach also felt that when the college season ended, the Celtics would have a great chance to sign Bird. Auerbach was right, and Bird signed soon after leading Indiana State to the NCAA championship game, where they fell to Michigan State University team. The other pick, which is the 8th pick, they selected Freeman Williams, who was traded before the 1978-1979 season even began. In 1978, that same year, ownership was changed as Irv Levin traded his stake in the Celtics with John Y. Brown Jr.'s Buffalo Braves, so he could move the Braves to California, where they became known as the San Diego Clippers. As part of the deal, trades were made between the Braves-Clippers franchise and the Celtics franchise, which resulted in many former Braves joining the team. One of the moves that really frustrated Auerbach was a trade Brown made with the Braves that saw Bob McAdoo join the Celtics for 3 first-round picks Auerbach had been planning to use for the future. This dispute nearly led to Auerbach quitting as general manager for a position with the New York Knicks. With public support strongly behind Auerbach, Brown sold the team to Harry Mangione rather than run the risk of having Auerbach leave the team. The Celtics season would be a struggle, going 29-53 without Larry Bird. Chris Ford, Rick Roby, Cedric Maxwell, and Tiny Archibald, they failed to reverse the team's momentum that season. Bird later debuted that season, a year after being drafted. With the new owner in place, Auerbach made several moves that would bring the team back to what it once was. He traded McAdoo, and he traded him for M.L. Carr, who was with the Detroit Pistons at that time, and for 2 first-round picks in the 1980 draft. They also picked up Gerald Henderson from the CBA. Carr, Archibald, Henderson, and Ford formed the highly competent backcourt with their unique skills blending in perfectly with the talented frontcourt of Cowens, Maxwell, and Bird, who would go on to win Rookie of the Year honors. The Celtics improved by 32 games, which at the time was the best single turnaround in NBA history, going 61-21 and losing to the Philadelphia 76ers in the Eastern Conference Finals. After this season, Auerbach completed what may be the most lopsided trade in NBA history. Auerbach had always been a fan of stockpiling draft picks, so even after the success of the 1979-1980 season, the Celtics had the 1st and 13th pick in the 1980 draft left over from the M.L. Carr trade. Auerbach saw an opportunity to improve the team immediately, saying those 2 picks in exchange for Robert Parrish and the 3rd pick in the draft. With that pick, Auerbach selected University of Minnesota power forward Kevin McHale. With 3 future Hall of Famers on the team now known as their Big Three and the first Big Three in NBA history, the Celtics had a core in place to again become a dominant team. The Celtics went 62-20 under coach Bill Fitch in the 1980-1981 season, despite losing Dave Cowens to retirement. Once again, the Celtics matched up with the 76ers in the Eastern Conference Finals. They fell behind 3-1 before coming back to win a classic Game 7, 91-90. They wanted to capture the NBA championship that year over the Houston Rockets, just 2 years after Larry Bird had been drafted. Cedric Maxwell was named the NBA Finals MVP. The following year after that, they again tried to come back from a 3-1 deficit against the 76ers, but this time it didn't go their way, which means they lost. In 1983, the Celtics were swept in the playoffs for the first time by the Milwaukee Bucks. Afterwards, Fitch quit and the team was sold to new owners led by Don Gaston. In 1983-1984, the Celtics under Casey Jones as their coach, who was a former player for them, if you remember earlier in this series, they would go 62-20 and finally get back to the NBA Finals after a 3-year hiatus. In the finals, the Celtics came back from a 2-1 deficit to defeat the Lakers, winning their 15th NBA championship. Bird renewed his college rivalry with Magic Johnson, who was the Lakers' franchise player at the time during this series. After this series, Auerbach retired as GM, but he was still the team president, which was now his new position. Auerbach was succeeded by Jan Volk as general manager. Volk had been with the Celtics since 1971, graduating from Columbia Law School, and had been the team's general counsel since 1976 and the team's assistant GM since 1980. During the offseason, in Volk's first major transaction since assuming the GM role, he traded Gerald Henderson to the Seattle Supersonics for their first-round pick in the 1986 NBA Draft. In 1985, the Lakers and Celtics met again, but this time the Lakers won the championship. This was the first time the Lakers had defeated the Celtics for an NBA championship, as well as the only time the Celtics lost a championship at Boston Garden. During the offseason, they acquired Bill Walton in exchange for Cedric Maxwell. He was a big star with the Portland Trail Blazers, and he could have been a top 10 player of all time, but he was injury plagued and he never lived up to the expectations he had. He was willing to come off the bench because they had already had three big men already teamed, three solid big men.